Hello guys, welcome back. So in today's class we would be introducing to YAML and then creating a Kubernetes deployment. So we have been talking about how to use Kubernetes to spin up resources. So far we have been working exclusively on the command line. But there is an easier and more useful way to do it, creating configuration files using YAML. In this lecture, we will look at how YAML work and use it to define first a Kubernetes pod and then a Kubernetes deployment. Before we proceed further, let's quickly introduce ourselves to YAML basics. Now, it is difficult to escape YAML if you are doing anything related to many software fields, particularly Kubernetes, SDN, and OpenStack. YAML when stands for yet another markup language, or YAML int markup language, depending what you ask, is human readable text based format for specifying configuration type information. For example, in this article we will pick apart from YAML definition for creating first a pod and then a deployment. Now, using YAML for K8s definition gives a number of advantages, including: one, convenience. So you will no longer have to add all of your parameters to the command line. Number two, maintenance. YAML files can be added to source control so you can track changes. And third, flexibility. You will be able to create much more complex structure using YAML than you can on the command line. So YAML is a superset of JSON, which means that any valid JSON file is also a valid YAML file, and that's a key thing to understand. So on the one hand, if you know JSON and you are only ever going to write your own YAML, you are all set. On the other hand, that's not very likely, unfortunately. Even if you are only trying to find examples on the web, they are most likely in the non-JSON or YAML. So we might as well get used to it. Still, there may be situation where the JSON format is more convenient, so it's good to know that it's available to you. Fortunately, there are only two types of structure you need to know about in YAML. One is list, other is map. That's it. You might have maps of list and list of maps and so on, but if you have got those two structures down, you are all set. That's not to say that there aren't more complex things you can do, but in general this is all you need to get started. So let's quickly talk about YAML maps. Let's start by looking at YAML maps. Maps let you associate name value pairs, which of course is convenient when you are trying to set up configuration information. For example, you might have a config file that starts something like API version v1 and kind is pod. The first line is a separator and is optional unless you are trying to define multiple structures in a single file. From there, as you can see, we have two values v1 and pod mapped to two keys, API version and kind. This kind of thing is pretty simple, of course, and you can think of it in terms of it JSON equivalent, which is, as you can see in the top where I'm pointing through my cursor. Now notice that in our YAML version, the quotation marks are optional. The processor can tell that you are looking at a string based on the formatting. You can also specify more complicated structures by creating a key that maps to another map rather than a string. In this case we have a key. If you see the second one, we have a key metadata that has as its value a map with two more keys, name and labels. The label key itself has a map as its value. You can nest these as far as you want to. The YAML processor knows how all these pieces relate to each other. Because we have identified the lines, in this example I have used two spaces for readability, but the number of spaces doesn't matter as long as it is least one, for as long as you are consistent. consistent rather. For example, name and labels are at the same indentation level, so the processor knows they are both pair of the same map. It knows that app is a value for labels because it is indented further. Now, one quick point to note is never use tabs in YAML file. So if we have to translate the file to JSON, it will look like something like this. Now coming on to YAML list. YAML lists are literally a sequence of objects. Now for example, if we just take arguments like sleep, 1000, message, bring back firefly, as you can see in this, you can have virtually any number of items in a list, which is defined as items that start with a dash indented from the parent. So in JSON, this would be, as you can see on the screen. And of course, member of the list can also be maps. Okay. Now, so as you can see here, we have a list of container objects, each of which right now what I have shown on the file on the screen is JSON version. But if you imagine, we have a list of container objects, each of which consists of a name, an image, and a list of ports. Each list item under port is itself a map that lists the container port and its value. For yes, and as you can see on the screen, for completeness, it's JSON equivalent. Okay. Now, as you can see, we are starting to get pretty complex, and we haven't ever gotten into anything particularly complicated. No wonder YML is replacing JSON so fast. So let's review. Right now we have maps, which are group of name value pairs, list, which are individual items, maps of maps, maps of list, list of list, list of maps. So basically whatever structure you want to put together, you can do it with those two structures. Okay. So now that we have got the basics out of the way, let's look at putting this to use, and we would be creating a pod using YAML. We are going to first create a pod, then a deployment using YAML. If you haven't set up your cluster and kubectl, go ahead and check my earlier lectures wherein I have explained the same. Let's start with a pod. Now creating the pod file. In our previous example, we described a simple pod using YAML. Now basically it is nothing but a couple of things like API version v1. Yeah, API version is v1, kind is pod, metadata, we are just keeping it blank, name is RSS site, label is again I'm keeping it blank, app is web, spec is again blank, container is name front end, image nginx, ports container port 80, name is RSS reader, image whatever we specify, ports and container ports in this case is 80 at which we are talking about. Taking it apart one piece at a time, we start with the API version. Here it is just v1. When we get to deployment, we will have to specify a different version because deployment don't exist in v1. Next, we are specifying that we want to create a pod. We might specify instead of deployment, job service and so on, depending on what we are trying to achieve. Next, we specify the metadata. Here we are specifically the name of the pod as well as the labels we will use to identify the pod to Kubernetes. Finally, we specify the actual objects that make up the pod, The spec property includes any containers, storage volumes, or other pieces that Kubernetes need to know about, as well as properties such as whether to restart the container. If it fails, you can find a complete list of Kubernetes pod we have already discussed and API specs as well in my earlier chapters. But let's take a closer look at typical container definition. And as you can see on the screen, in this case we have simple, fairly minimal definition, a name, the image on which it is based, nginx, and one port on which the container will listen internally. Of these, only the name is really required. But in general, if you want to do anything useful, you will need more information. So you can also specify more complex properties such as command to run, when the container starts, argument it should use a working directory, or whether to pull a new copy of the image every time it is instantiated. You can also specify even deeper information such as the location of the container's exit log, etc. So here are the properties you can set for a container, just to keep you at the top of your mind: name, image, command, arguments, working directory, ports, resources, volume minds, liveness probe, readiness probe, life cycle, termination message path, image pull policy, security context, and so on. Now with this, I'm taking a pause and I'm just stopping here. In the next lecture, we would be talking more how to create the pod using YAML file. So till then, thank you very much. See you soon.